Welcome to the Thresholds of Reality, the podcast where we explore unexplained and mysterious events, phenomena, and legends. Today we are joined by Matt and Tom from the Occult Disney Podcast, and we are going to explore all the weird things going on at Disney. So strap in as we explore the edges of the unknown. All right. Matt and Tom, thank you guys so much for joining us today. The first question I have is, I've never been to Disneyland. Do you guys spend a lot of time at Disneyland?
You can go, Matt.
My hometown is my hometown's Atlanta, so Orlando, like a 10-12 hour burn down the highway. So I do that a few. My parents took me a few times. I went a few times as an adult. Living in Japan, we have Tokyo Disney Sea and Tokyo Disneyland, which I don't live in Tokyo. I live in the mountains, which it's not that far, but when I was in my 20s and young and hip and single, I'd go like 2 or 3 times a year. For the past 15 years or so, since having a kid, not so much, but I still have a weird theme park obsession, which is sort of how this got started, even though we are talking about the movies.
Okay.
And I grew up in Florida, so I had been to Disney a few times, but I also worked at Disney here in Orlando for about 10 years. I worked at the Roy O. Disney animation building on the back lot, right next to the animation spot. So I worked in a little place they used to call the Fishbowl. So if you ever did a back tour where they put you on a little tram and they drive around through the back lot and they've got like a stunt driving course, and then they're like, and here's the animation room. Well, that was the room that I worked in.
So people oohed and awed at you?
They did until they tinted the windows out, because they call it the fishbowl. Because also when people would drive by, everyone would make like little fish faces in the window as they went by.
Well, that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, that is what you're supposed to do.
That's hilarious. So, if you've been, Disney is part of American culture, and now it's becoming part of global culture, right? And it's such an iconic thing. Why tackle the spooky mysteries of Disney?
I'll lead on
one
that.
of the things.
Oh, sorry, you go, Matt.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Well, I was going to mention that
from here. Okay, go ahead.
there's a tiny delay since Matt's in Japan and I'm in Orlando, so the mysteries of technology are just slightly apparent here. But yeah, we ended up doing some
Wi-Fi.
We ended up doing deep dives on Disney, most of all because it seemed that there's these really dark and specific connections between old folklore, specifically the Grimm's brothers fairy tales, and Disney, and that they kept going back to the same well over and over. So that's where my kind of fascination started, was realizing that without Grimm, we would probably have a lot less Disney, but there's all sorts of interesting connotations that go with it, because without Grimm, we also wouldn't have a whole lot of other things, like Germany in World War II might not have even existed without the Grimm's brother fairy tales. So Disney has a lot of strange connections to early Americana, for sure.
So what was that movie that you were just like, oh, I see what they're doing?
For me, it was Pinocchio was the big one, but also Matt and I went deep on Fantasia, and I am convinced at this point, beyond just like the clickbaity claims, but I really do think that Fantasia was likely a real magical incantation, and it created the reality of Disney as its own sort of dimension. Like the whole world of Disney actually exists now, right? Like your kids know what Disney are, you know what Disney is. It's going to outlive everyone that's talking right now by at least a factor of a century, probably. And I think that all started with that little Mickey putting on, the wizard's hat, and kind of like bringing this all into existence. And Fantasia is a very real, like, animated spell that's like, here we are creating this completely fictional reality that is now going to become just as real as the reality and it happened that way.
All right, Matt, you got a response?
Yeah, just in the news last week, and I'm not really. I mean, I'm talking about, like, synchronicities of the universe here. But just last week, we have Mickey Mouse, as he is in Fantasia, taking down the Maleficent dragon, which is basically Chernobog. And if you've seen this news, you should definitely watch the video. The entire animatronic dragon sets on, like, hellfire, and the audience is sitting there watching it for like a good 5 minutes before the announcement starts. The show has to finish now, and they start playing like Frontierland music, meanwhile there's this giant dragon on fire. I'm like, it's almost like that's the sort of thing where Fantasia set the spell. It was the incantation, as you say, and now it's like fully in reality. That was like Fantasia happening in front of everyone's eyes. Phantasmic, definitely the best iteration of the show you ever could have seen, as the entire thing gets emulated.
Fantasia happens to be like one of my favorites. Like, it's, for, it just being music and it just being, somehow it engrosses you, like you're saying, like the spell, like it's, and it's like this mind trip that you're actually watching. And I like that it does that to you. It's one of those few Disney movies that actually does that to you. Like, it puts you, like, it's almost like a different plane.
It was so incredibly ambitious, but just the plot, the loose plot of Fantasia, which differs depending on who edited the segments together and what order they decided to put them in and everything. But it really does tell the origin, as you watch it, almost of like reality or the universe itself, right? It kind of starts with this big bang, and then they show like frequencies starting to form, which start as sound, and then it turns into color, and then color turns into shape, and then the shape turns into form, and then all of a sudden you see amoebas and bugs and animals, and it turns into dinosaurs, and it goes through like the entire history. But I think that's also them saying that's not illustrating humans' Big Bang. This is Disney's Big Bang. Like, this is their universe coming into sort of being. And then if you notice, a lot of those early characters that you see for the first time in Fantasia end up becoming archetypes for many future Disney characters that you just kind of see repeat over and over again.
What would you say to someone who says that,
as we've been moving
Disney
through the film, same out?
Sorry. What would you say to someone who says that Disney went to the Grimm's fairy tale well so many times because it was public domain and you didn't have to pay for rights?
Well, I'd say that those stories already had longevity for a reason, and it wasn't because they were public domain, because this is before anyone cared much about that. The Grimm's fairy tales, they started out as historians of Germanic history, and without some of their original non-fictional, historical takes, there's a consideration that a lot of Germanic history might have never been reinvigorated. It might have just like gone away with time. So on top of them building with their credibility on just Germanic history in general, they also decided to just go deep and discover every old wives' tale and every folk tale. And they trek through the woods and would go and like knock on that old lady's door that hasn't come out or no one's seen from her in like 10, 20 years and be like, tell us all of your stories. Tell us all your grandparents' stories. So it wasn't just this public domain thing. They actually tracked down, I guess, like the original mythology. So instead of, the Greek mythos or the Roman mythos and, the Phoenicians that everyone kind of knows, this was largely undiscovered and a little bit more folksy. But now you can see with Grimm's and through Disney, imagine a world where, Cinderella and Little Red Riding Hood and, a lot of these other stories didn't exist. Right now, that kind of forms the basis of what most Westerners consider as, fairy tales and like the whole princess archetype. A lot of that wouldn't exist in the same form nearly at all without Grimm and then Disney.
Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, I was just saying, if we look at now, like American mythology, this is Grimm stuff is European mythology. Pinocchio is Italian. Disney now has created the American mythology too, mostly by buying it, right? But I mean, what's American mythology? That's basically what Star Wars and Marvel now, right? So,
I'd say Frog Princess
it-
might be in there.
Johnny Appleseed.
yeah, all that stuff. So they are, I mean, not the gatekeeper, but the company for good or bad. I mean, we should say we're not doing this like terrible to the company. We like this stuff, but we are like, what images are in there? And I'm sure we'd be happy to bash a lot of corporate decisions that say the company makes. But yeah, it is weird. And with those mythologies, though, the weird thing is now that it is being corporatized, like the Grimm stuff doesn't burn out. I've burnt out on like Star Wars and Marvel. So looking at these old animated films, seeing that this magical material, all the Grimm stuff, it seems it's a little more fascinating, I think.
So when you say, like, okay, like you said, Pinocchio was one that like what in Pinocchio like really got you? You're like, okay, I got it. I know what they're doing. Like, is it the story itself, or was there
It's everything.
something in
It's the name of
background?
the story. It's the original authors. It's how it was readapted. So Pinocchio being one of the better ones. Pinocchio kind of breaks down, etymology-wise in Italian to sort of like the pineal eye. Pino meaning pine, and then occhio is the eye. So there's already this esoteric connotation of the third eye, the pineal gland. There's also the aspect of Pleasure Island where he goes, he gets kind of like kidnapped and hoisted away. This was representative of an actual thing that was happening in Italy at the time that this was written during all these different political revolutionary, period. But it also, if you notice, they turn into asses and donkeys when they go to Pleasure Island too long. And that's an really interesting nod to a story called The Golden Ass, which dates to like the 2nd century AD, like year 160 or something, about someone that gets transformed into an ass because that they're sort of not paying attention and not following along, and they have to like plead this big case and go on this big journey. And that is absolutely an alchemical tale. So there's all these allegory where Pinocchio blends all this together. You've got the story of Jonah and the whale, right, where Geppetto goes underwater. So Pinocchio is like a Whitman sampler of esoteric teachings, I think, and it just spans many cultures and time periods, and it puts it into this story that we're still retelling. I mean, what was there, like 2 or 3 new Pinocchio movies that came out in the last 12 months alone? So that story in particular is not going anywhere. And the Italian revolutionary aspect of this too, this was at a time when Italy had so many secret societies all over the place. Like the Carbonari was slightly a little bit after that, but they had many others. And it was in a time where you couldn't get any sort of political capital whatsoever unless you were a member of multiple secret societies. And all this is baked into the story of Pinocchio, but you wouldn't know it unless you get into the history of it.
It seems like there's a lot to uncover there. Primarily, I'm surprised that the Golden Ass isn't a swimsuit competition.
I mean, it's anything could happen at this point, right? With enough AI prompts, we can turn that into something by the end of this episode.
All right, that's a challenge. We leave that challenge to the audience. We'll leave that to the viewers to find us the Golden Ass. But moving forward, I've heard the Pinocchio pineal gland, third eye connection, and a lot of these types of stories, fairy tales, become reflections of the current society in which they're born. But why does that make it an occult thing?
You go, Matt.
Occult, I mean, the way we're working with occult is simply the simple meaning of hidden. And with a lot of Disney movies, we're fortunate that tends to be kind of, magical stuff. So we get to rant on the show about like homunculuses and things like that sometimes. Sometimes occult is less nefarious sounding. It could just be like real interesting details. I mean, we've had movies, a few like doing Lady and the Tramp, there's not that much there that seems like occulted, so to speak. But we always manage to, get a thing or two out. I'm the one that usually comes up with like, wild ass observation theories and production trivia sort of stuff, where Thomas comes in with the couple rants about Fantasia and Pinocchio you've always heard, with that way back when information that is fascinating.
And Lady and the Tramp, there might be a CIA Skull and Bones connection there, although very loose. But you notice that in some of the few shots, there's lots of homages to Yale and the fact that they're already in this like upper crust society. That one's Lady and the Tramp, granted, is probably one of the biggest stretches where we had to like find sort of like occult symbolism. But there's been other movies that we've covered where I was expecting to have to do like some big reaching or, just kind of being a little bit fanciful with it for some information. And we get into it and it's like, wow, this movie was actually truly occult. What was it not 101 Dalmatians? What was the movie that had the Twilight barking that came right afterwards?
Yeah, that was 101 Dalmatians, which is definitely one of the strangest kinds.
So a lot of people don't realize this one because there was the 101 Dalmatians movie, and then they had Disney had their own sequels, but the original written sequel for the book by the original author, blanking on her name, it was called The Twilight Barking, and it was about one morning, all of humanity is just frozen in bed. Nobody wakes up. They're just kind of frozen in place, and the only animals that still are free to move are the dogs of the world. And not only can they move, but they can fly. And not only can they fly, but they hover above the ground and can basically fly at like supersonic speeds. They can control electronics with their mind. And this dog god from the Sirius star system comes to the planet Earth and communicates to all the dogs telepathically, and allows all other dogs to communicate with each other's telepathically, and basically says the world's going to end. There's going to be a huge nuclear war that wipes out the entire planet Earth, and all the dogs have two options. You can come back with me to the Sirius system, and we all live as, gods in the sky, or you can kind of tough it out on Earth and try to help humanity. And the dogs collectively are like, we're going to stay on Earth. We love our masters so much. We love humans. We're going to try and save them. And this was kind of written in a time of conscientious objector, like people were kind of anti-war, so that had this undertones of like nuclear war might be coming. But man, to understate the occult aspects of a god, dog god from the Sirius star system, telepathic travel, influencing electronics with your mind, and this was written in like the very early 20th century. We're not talking about the 70s or the 80s where some of this might have made sense. This is like way ahead of its time. That's just one example of many of weird sort of like angles I never expected to run into.
That is pretty wild. That's a wild
Bambi. Take. What's the occult with Bambi?
Have you guys covered Bambi? Have you dug deep into Bambi?
We have, yeah. So I'm giving Matt a lead here because of the delay.
I mean, that one, of course, has the yeah, I get it. That one, of course, it has sort of like animalistic thing, spirits, that sort of thing. I mean, it is the circle of life. One thing with these early movies like Bambi, Pinocchio, like we're here in 2023 looking at them and kind of picking out things. Oh, we didn't notice those as kids, and people generally don't notice those as now. But audiences of, the 40s might have. It hadn't been that long since occultism had been sort of a, parlor room fad and all of that sort of thing. So it's kind of, some of the stuff is more occulted now than it was then. As far as Bambi, I'm blanking on the specifics. It's been a year since we did that.
So I pulled up my notes because Bambi was a tough one, but for example, on movies that we can't find like very specific occult references, we find all sorts of interesting backstories. So for example, the story of Bambi was originally written by an Austro-Hungarian guy named Felix, who was a hunter who had killed like over 200 deer in his lifetime that he claimed. But then it was translated into from Russian. That was a Russian, but it was translated by a double agent Soviet spy. So like, this really weird aspect that we find of all these original Disney stories, even the Brothers Grimm and the translations that come from it, intelligence agencies and high society tend to be these two very common recurring themes. And one of them comes up where it's like, out of all the stories in the world, why 101 Dalmatians? Why Lady and the Tramp? Why, Mary Poppins? What was it about these, stories in particular, amongst the thousands or tens of thousands or more they could have picked from? And one common theme is that they tend to be written by rich people's children, or a rich person, or in a lot of cases, someone that like went to war and garnished all sorts of rapport with intelligence agencies or high up with the government. And then they leave and start writing children's books. And then all of a sudden those children's books get propagated throughout Europe and America and become like these big hits. And happening 2 or 3 times, it might make sense. But when it happens so often in this research, it like those interesting kind of themes kind of present themselves as more than just coincidence. So that's one aspect of it. And then also that Bambi was intentionally made to kind of tone down the magic, because Disney had been criticized a little bit about everything being a little bit too fanciful. They were kind of like always leaning into that angle. So Bambi becomes sort of like the anti-hero, the anti-magic version of Disney. But in so they almost define their own spectrum, right? So that they're kind of saying like, here's the fantastical Fantasia, here's the Bambi, where you still have talking animals, and you still have this like the Green Man sort of return to nature magic, but it's far less supernatural than like all these other properties, and everything kind of like fits in between these two boundaries.
I guess something with Bambi that was very interesting was the book is incredibly violent and gory, which
yeah, it sounds like you're kind of hinting at there being a propaganda or mind control agenda behind these children's books. Is that what I'm picking up?
Kind of like it's a good basis for that sort of thing. There's so much imagery that has like, a magical reference, someone called to reference. So you could have something with Alice in Wonderland, which, when we did that one, the CIA has a page in its handbook about
Alice in Wonderland programming.
Yeah, where you have someone in custody and you just keep changing the clocks on them. What did you say? Serving dinner 5 minutes after breakfast.
Correct.
You use that frame of mind in something like the CIA. So it's sort of like a chicken or the egg situation. That's why I'm, I guess, a big fan in the end of just universal synchronicities. It's like the universe is doing a lot of this. You can see it in your own life, and so it's a little of them putting in these elements that, you want to mind control your audience because you want them to come see your next movie, right? So in that way, that's true. And then, but there's those elements can also be used for much deeper levels of mind control by Disney itself or other people. So
an analogy I like to bring up when this comes up is that it's almost like a sailor or a captain of a boat that's been sailing for 20-30 years. It's not like when they set out to sail, they tell the waves which way to go and they tell the wind which way to go and they're in control of everything. It's more that they know how to read the waves and they know how to read the stars and kind of like read the environment and use it to their advantage at every turn. So even if you're going against the wind, you know how to maneuver and use that to your advantage. So I think that the way Disney and a lot of other sort of like creative companies work that capitalize on these ancient archetypes and symbols and stories is it's not like they're doing intentional mind control, but it's like they understand how the mind works, and why wouldn't you lean into the things that work and make use of archetypes in a way that are impactful and would make your legacy way more long lasting, as opposed to just like shooting in the dark. So it's like, if you know what you're doing, does that mean you're mind control, or do you just have a firm control over how to manipulate reality because that's what you're good at doing?
I mean, when my daughter was 3.5, we had to ride It's a Small World 4 times in a row, and that certainly had an effect on my mind.
They haven't been the same since, huh?
Well, I would say that there might be some breakdown in that reading of the waves, because it seems like there's been a little bit of a cultural revolt to some extent against Disney in recent years, whereas it seemed like everyone was very eager to give them their money, and now there's been some resistance because of kind of the overtness of the messaging. Why do you think that they might have steered away? Did they stop employing secret agents?
Well, I'll kick this one off really quick. Is that I think one of the most entertaining aspects from the outside looking in, when you talk about Disney and occult, inevitably MK Ultra and Disney programming and Project Monarch, that's usually what comes up. So part of the premise when me and Matt started the series was that, well, prior to like 1949 or basically like 1952 or something, when MK Ultra was official, everything prior to that, it would be very hard to be like, oh, this is all MK Ultra stuff, because it predated the actual, government operation. But like he was mentioning, the Alice in Wonderland programming, it might have been this symbiotic relationship where Disney establishes these archetypes that kids are familiar with and parents are familiar with, and in general, they kind of had this monopoly on constructing reality through cartoons. There wasn't a lot of other companies that were doing cartoons on this long format with music and traveling roadshow style animation, so they really did bring this into being. And then I think that it's almost like mind control then gets used on top of Disney. Not that Disney starts with, we're gonna control minds. It's like the mind control guys like, oh, these archetypes exist, there's this concept of always needing to like save the princess, or that the family's abandoned you, or you've been orphaned, and those things can be instilled. So I think that it starts from that premise and then builds outwards from there. Does that make sense?
Just for some really straight from A to B sort of influence on that, we did a little detour. Not really a detour, it's pretty much an animated Disney movie. One of the lesser known ones though is Victory through Air Power, which Walt Disney himself put a lot of money into, for mostly the express purpose of people like FDR and other top government people seeing this film and agreeing with the idea that the World War II would be won through the use of air power, which, except for dropping of the atomic bomb, is more or less how it played out. So it seems that this movie did really have a major world influence. Maybe they came to that conclusion on their own, but you watch the movie and you're like, hey, this is 1943, and we're watching what more or less would actually happen up to July 1945.
Could you imagine the pushback now if Disney came out and started making animations about war bonds and World War III? It seems like the type of pushback they're getting now feels like it would pale in comparison to the same sort of tactics that Disney was doing in the 40s and 50s.
I think people would be up in arms now.
Yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with the idea that the World War II was a just war, quote unquote just war. And every war since then has been about capitalizing on some perceived resource or monetary advantage, and so they have not been quote unquote just wars. Not that any war is a great thing to have, but I feel like the public itself.
On the surface, yeah, but then that's a great example, because what happened at the tail end of World War II, Project Paperclip, we started importing all the Nazis into the U.S., and a few of those Nazis, one in particular, ended up getting a weekly show on Disney, and turns into like a guy that everyone, I'm talking about Werner von Braun essentially here. There was a few others. Yeah. But he becomes like a children's mascot. This guy was literally in the SS. He was a high ranking. He had, he was given multiple awards from the Nazis, and then they just turned him into like a good guy. So, I mean, it was a just war in that after America decided to stop being non-interventionist, let's ignore the fact that Coca-Cola went over there with Fanta, and we had all sorts of oil sort of endeavors out there. Like, we were absolutely helping. And if anything, World War II happened because of the impression that the early American eugenicists made on the Germans, and they just decided to take it to the next level. So everything that was unjust about World War II, you could almost turn back around and say America did that, or America kind of like lit that fire originally, the same way that like Henry Ford had a picture of Hitler on his desk and vice versa.
Well, I would say I'm not trying to turn this into a debate about war, but I would say that the public's perception of war changed drastically after World War II, and so I think that would be kind of the difference maker between pro-American military films of the 1940s versus military propaganda today, or pro-military propaganda today, is that we now kind of see behind the curtain a lot more than we did back then. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. We also don't have popular Disney IP being repurposed. Like, we don't have Daffy Duck or Donald Duck acting as Hitler and vice versa, and having like Bugs go and like slap Hitler in the face. It was weird because like Disney cartoons were absolutely weaponized, not just for pro-war, but also to like disparage, all of our enemies. And that feels like something that they don't necessarily do today, because I don't know. I don't. It would be weird to see like Disney come out with a feature-length movie that features Putin and like like Mickey punching Putin or something. Yeah, well, it's a good point, man. They also have some Epstein references in Black Widow.
Yeah, I think they just stopped animating them. They use CGI now.
They just lowered the budget. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a different format. But yeah,
a
Marvel movies. Go ahead.
A lot were also like a lot of war films were also training films, which theoretically they could still be taking contracts to make those. I mean, it might not look like a Disney film, but what is the Laurel Canyon thing with the film? This isn't Disney, but they have the film studio that apparently is top secret, and they've just made insane amounts of movies there for to show to government purposes, things like that, in-house filmmaking.
Yeah,
that rant's basically finished. I was thinking that Disney might make some of these, we just don't see them because they're not for public consumption.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, got to pay the bills.
I would like to know what Disney cartoons modeled after other wars might have looked like. Like Vietnam Disney and Desert Storm Disney.
A bunch of talking trees. None of them are speaking English. Hey, that happened in Fantasia.
Oh, there's a great clip I saw on YouTube. This is not Disney, but it had like Mickey Mouse and Goofy as like the deer hunter in Vietnam. So maybe it would look like that, where Goofy's like, look me in the eye and tell us our government hasn't failed us. I'm gonna have to kill you, Goofy. So maybe like that. I don't know.
Well, as the IP expires, we might be able to look forward to a lot of that.
Yeah, well, only Steamboat Willie is expiring next
for
year,
now,
so.
and also Mickey without pupils, I believe, is another one.
Right.
Although, who wants to be the very first one that actually tries to commercialize, Oswald or Mickey and go up against? Because all Disney has to do is just have like one of each of their lawyers just draft a letter to you, and now hopefully you don't have a job, because then you've got to respond to all of these. So I feel like someone's gonna toe that line. I'm interested to see what happens.
Let's do it. Thresholds of Reality.
We're seeing a little bit of.
Go ahead.
Yeah. What is it? When we did the Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh a few weeks ago, we did one of the first kind of, I guess, one of these IP breaking things with Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey, which, spoiler alert, wasn't very good, though. We did like the weird suits, but that's the first thing where we're going to see that with pupilless Mickey and Oswald the Lucky Rabbit probably in the next couple of years, I'm sure.
That was a fun one too, because like, for example, the Winnie the Pooh that we went over, everyone's kind of broken down Winnie the Pooh at this point, and everyone in that story kind of represents a different neuroses, right? Like you've got depression and OCD and everything, but we took another spin on it and broke it down as if every character represented a Gnostic archetype. And the fun one of this is that Christopher Robin ends up becoming the Antichrist, and that's sort of a breakdown.
Oh man, yeah, you'll have to
You
fill
would
us
play
in
the
on that
others where
one.
we,
How does that work out?
Well, it was a tie between the Demiurge and the Antichrist, but it kind of fit the Antichrist because Christopher Robin represented this other reality, this other world that none of the animals were necessarily privy to, and he was also like the sole conductor of telling them what this other world acted like. So he kind of links them to this human world. The Demiurge would have been kind of like the creator of that world, but Christopher Robin is not the creator of the forest that they all live in. He's just kind of an actor within it, and he leads them around, even though he himself isn't necessarily a god. To the animals, he's the closest thing that comes to God. So there, it's a fine line between Demiurge, which might be kind of like this toddler that you imagine is your god, but really they have a parent and so on. But when it comes down to it, calling him the Antichrist is way cooler than calling him the Demiurge.
Yeah, demiurge isn't a word that gets a lot of play in popular culture.
Antichrist has a better ring to it.
Yeah, it's definitely more evocative. One of our viewers
Yeah, we've
wants
had a
to know. Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I was just said we have had a few of these times where we do kind of feel like pairing it up. That one makes sense. I guess the one that makes the least sense is probably the aristocrats, the aristocats we did together. But just for some modern stuff at the end of the show, we were talking about how we would make our aristocrats joke, which Thomas did by feeding the material into Chat GPT and getting results where it felt like the joke. It was never quite obscene. It was never quite funny, and it was all very disturbing.
Yeah. Goal achieved.
That's hilarious. Okay, one of our viewers wants to know if you know about the Omni rumor, where all the movies are connected through various characters.
Yeah, I mean, this one, I don't know every permutation of the Omni rumor, but it's essentially that there's like a grand unification theory between all the Disney films, and specifically the characters. And I kind of hinted at this in Fantasia creating Disney as its own reality in this world. And that's where you see a lot of like those trees, and you see the elephants, and you see a lot like owls. You see a lot of characters that don't necessarily have any lines or characteristics or personality yet, but you just kind of get introduced to them slowly. Chernobog's another really great examples of this one, where that initial form of Chernobog, he's got these two big horns, right? Well, you can see that exact sort of silhouette take place and take shape over all of the evil witches, like Maleficent, right? Maleficent has that same exact silhouette. So I think this gives a lot of credit to this like Omni rumor where everything connects. If you also pay attention to what the owl looks like in Fox and the Hound, in Winnie the Pooh, and like 4 or 5 Sword in the Stone, it's like the exact same owl, maybe with a different voice here and there, but it's the same drawing, even to the point where some people say they were being lazy, like copying between, say, Robin Hood and the Jungle Book, and kind of like reusing frames.
That's what I was about to bring up. Yeah.
Well, so I mean, is it lazy, or is that kind of like how magic works, where if you just keep performing the same incantation over and over, you're just adding more and more energy and power to that one particular archetype? So I think you can make a strong argument that might just be Disney, sure, maybe cutting costs, but it also might be just embedding that into your, the back of your head. That's their super strong programming, is to show you the same owl over and over, and not out of laziness, but out of like, this is the Disney owl. If you see this owl, this is Disney, and you love it and you fell in love with it, and this is nostalgia. Like that, it's all kind of baked into this one symbol. And if you keep harping on that one symbol over and over, that gives it way more power than if you reintroduce what an owl looks like in every single movie. So you can take that and extrapolate it into this Omni rumor.
Okay, well, you guys.
This goes.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
As well. Yeah. Sorry about the delay. This goes into other movies as well. An example: I play in orchestra music a lot. People writing their symphonies. When you do your Fifth Symphony, somewhere in there, you're not supposed to, but almost every composer will put in the dun 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 motif somewhere in their Fifth Symphony, as a reference to Beethoven. A lot of composers in their Ninth Symphony will do a variation of the Ode to Joy also because of Beethoven. That's sort of like us using the same owl, using the same animatic. Fantasia has Stravinsky's Rite of Spring. If you start studying Stravinsky, fantastic orchestrator, the man ripped off almost every one of his themes. He almost never wrote original music. He's just taking motifs from the past, folk songs, and doing something new with them. So, if you do have the same animatic from the Jungle Book, I mean, it's kind of a nod to that. It's even if there isn't a narrative thread to tie all the movies together, it's tying the style together for sure. So makes it feel consistent and saves a little time and money.
And the voices, like very often you'd see the same voice, work with the same character, even between properties where it's not the same character, but it's the same visual and the same voice that goes with the visual.
It kind of blew my mind once we have Ka, Sir Hiss, and Winnie the Pooh all having exactly the same voice.
Right. Now, one of the things that I have always wondered about Disney is why did they tread into such dark territory with movies like The Black Cauldron or Something Wicked This Way Comes? Do you guys ever tackle any of those really darker, kind of older Disney movies from the 80s?
I think The Black Cauldron is maybe 2 movies in our future. So just to plug ourselves, check in about a month and we will get deep into The Black Cauldron. But I haven't seen it since 1986 at this point. So
fair enough.
And Black Cauldron was the movie that Don Bluth, I think, had a huge role in by name at that point. I think he worked on Sword in the Stone, but a lot of it went uncredited. But Black Cauldron helped kind of break up Disney and split Bluth off from Disney, where he went and started his own thing. So that's actually a really good example of sort of an interesting turning point for Disney. I don't know if Black Cauldron was necessarily in their wheelhouse. That might have just been something that happened due to circumstance. Walt, no longer being as active, dead, but no longer as active in sort of like the decision making. Because Walt also, towards the very end, he had a lot of creative control over things to the point where almost it seemed like everyone would be working against him or just not seeing the same vision as him. But if he was involved, you kind of had to do what Walt said. And as soon as that dynamic broke, this is where a lot of the focus maybe got a little bit even more scattered, even more so than when, he had so many different irons in the fire that he wasn't giving it his full attention anymore.
Yeah,
okay.
We have found Disney's a little from the 70s, although they have fantastic credit sequences. But that's when, Walt had been gone for a while. We didn't have the 80s. The big difference in the Disney Renaissance, that's Eisner and Katzenberg coming in as a full-blown, horrible and great guys at the same time for running this business. They at least had a vision.
True.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just, really, you've got to have some episodes dedicated to Something Wicked This Way Comes, which is a Halloween classic. Kind of got overshadowed by Hocus Pocus, but certainly way darker than Hocus Pocus in that kind of demonic presence that's always like just at the back of the kids in pursuit. I think a lot of that kind of iconography or storytelling was then adapted for Hocus Pocus, but made a lot more comical or child friendly, but certainly very similar.
As Disney grew too and started turning more into a global, super conglomerate essentially, and not just this little animation studio stateside, they own a lot more darker things that they just don't give themselves credit for. Like I believe, for example, the first few Insane Clown Posse records are technically owned by Disney. So
Yes,
if you were listening to or purchased an Insane Clown Posse album, that money went to Disney. So I mean, just because they didn't have like the specific Disney stamp of approval somewhere on the front doesn't mean they don't have their fingers in all sorts of interesting creative projects out there.
So it would be really fascinating to go to Disneyland and buy a Juggalo face paint, you know.
But you can go to their
Get
Galaxy's Edge now and get like equal weird stuff for sure, even if it's not ICP labeled or branded.
Right. The Juggalos in Marvel's Adventures, and then at Galaxy's Edge, yeah.
How cool would it be that after
I
you
think-
leave Tomorrowland, you can enter Juggalo Land? That would be the coolest thing ever.
Where you're drinking Faygo and listen to.
The Juggalo overlay for a week, or that'd be fun.
They do a gathering of the Juggalos at Disney World.
Technically, Pulp Fiction's a Disney movie. I think it's Miramax Touchstone, which they owned at the time. All those weird movies, a lot of violent movies from the 90s that are Touchstone films are technically Disney. That's just Disney in disguise.
Right. And so let me ask you guys, what are some of the things that people would be really, really shocked? Like what are some of the most shocking things you guys have uncovered about Disney movies?
The most response I've gotten is the Twilight barking. I've had a few people that listen that didn't make them angry at us. That just made them angry. I think that's why we brought up earlier, because that's the real biggie. What was the motif that we've noticed in several films of the old man in the woods, like kind of bringing a kid there to teach him? That's
so that one.
That
This one has ruined a lot of my favorite Disney movies, because we go back and watch it, and it's, it may or may not live up to what you remember from nostalgia and rose-colored glasses and all. But then you start looking into, okay, who wrote this original story? Who was the one that adapted it? Who's the one that decided to make this one? And this is many, many examples. I think Lewis Carroll, there's lots of research that shows him as a very problematic person at the time. But he was definitely not the outlier out of all of the Disney-based sort of movies. Another one is Sword in the Stone. That one used to be like my absolute favorite. And you find out that the writer very much was an older man that just was fascinated with young boys and only wanted to be friends with young boys in a very strange and odd way. And in that context, and that was like his life story. I mean, he basically struggled with his unrealized sort of difference in lifestyle. I guess he never fully came to terms with it, and it became a big problem for him for his entire life. But the story of Sword in the Stone, it's about an old dude that lives in the woods and wants to go and lure a young boy away from his family, an orphan boy, and basically teach him how he wanted this kid to live, to be his little companion. And when you read it in the context of the actual writer of the original story, it really does feel like it was like a self-serving story where it's like, I want to move out into the woods and I want to have a young boy live with me and just kind of become, almost like a patron. So that theme in particular recurs so damn often to now, if I really like the movie, I just won't even look into the background of the original author, because I just assume that it's very problematic.
Wow.
The other one that I a lot of fun. So we basically worked out that Mary Poppins is actually like an evil witch, and Dick Van Dyke is her homunculus. That was our fun take.
Yeah, she gaslights those children. Well, she gaslights the children throughout the entire movie. Even when they come back from that fantastic trip where they jump into the sidewalk painting, the Dick Van Dyke, and they do the penguin dance, and they go on the race and everything. And after they come back, and the kids are like, "Wow, I can't believe this crazy adventure we went on today." And Mary Poppins is like, "What are you talking about? We didn't do anything." And just that sort of dynamic where, wait, I thought she was this altruistic woman that was trying to help open their imaginations and anything is possible and yada yada, but then she just immediately starts gaslighting them. That feels to me like the ultimate evil thing that a Disney person could possibly do, is show you all this magic and wonder and then tell you that it was all just your imagination, that you're going crazy, especially to two children who are still kind of forming their impression of reality in general. And then another common motif is that you look at
whoa.
actors.
Before you move on from Mary Poppins, spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down.
That's mind
Right,
control. That's
she gives
a,
them the
a
medicine.
Disney movie helps the propaganda go down. That's
start
the premise.
tripping. Yeah, she's feeding them drugs, man.
But I wasn't even going to change it from Mary Poppins. I mentioned that, like, the little girl from Mary Poppins decided she never wanted to act again after that, and a short foray right after. And the little boy, he ended up dying of some horrible side effect of potentially a heroin overdose in India. So there's so much tragedy with anyone that ends up. Dick Van Dyke was just like a raging alcoholic throughout that entire movie. It almost broke him. He might not have even survived the tail end of it outside the support that he was getting. And I believe Mary Poppins herself developed. She was like chain smoking the entire time, and apparently she had the worst mouth on set. That the children basically said that they heard more profanity out of Mary Poppins than of anyone else on the cast. And this is a fun little side note that right after Mary Poppins, the children starred in a movie called The Gnome Mobile. This is fever dream material. So a lot of people haven't even heard of Gnome Mobile. It's about these kids and their like rich uncle or grandpa or something owns the redwood forest, same redwood forest where Bohemian Grove is at. And I mentioned that because there's an interesting side note on this. But the movie is that they find like this little gnome that lives in the redwood forest, and they have to like get this gnome to hook up with like a female gnome. So they're just like trying to get this little dude laid and like repropagate this gnome species. But the only reason I even heard about the Gnomemobile movie, which is absolutely insane, but that Walt Disney, and this might be rumor, but I'm trying to look into it, that he was trying to make a special projection system that would work specifically in the Redwood Forest for Bohemian Grove, where he could project some kind of movie on the trees, and it would have some kind of like a 3D sort of aspect to it. So once I heard that Walt might have been working on a custom animation for Bohemian Grove, and then that this movie might have been tangentially related as he was like, investigating all this, I was all in. So yeah, if you've ever heard of that, it's not the best movie, but it's absolutely worth watching just to prove that it exists.
So it's a movie that combines advanced projection techniques, fantasy animal husbandry, and
gnome sex.
Hippies.
Yeah, lots of
few weird
and well, that movie didn't actually have any of the projection in it. I think that the story was that he was trying to work on this thing that used projection, but it might have been a little bit overly ambitious. So instead, you get this like D-rate sort of movie.
Fascinating. So Mary Poppins, actors' lives are what they are, right? And ironically, people look at them now with such fondness because of the characters they played. And it's probably because it was a lot easier to keep your private life out of the public back then.
Oh yeah.
Whereas now celebrity is such an intoxicating thing for the public that you got the paparazzi all the time exposing people's personal lives. And so it's very difficult to separate your professional and personal life for celebrities. But the idea of kind of Mary Poppins being a gaslighter extraordinaire, that's wild, because there's a lot of that kind of thing that happens in these fantasy movies where you have the adult who's kind of winking at the kids. This is just between us. Wink, wink. Keep it quiet. And
a little creepy once you start getting into those undertones, man. And another one too that becomes very prevalent is that this almost like honoring of your incredibly alcoholic uncle, or like there's always a drunk uncle that everyone's always like delighted to be around. He just got kicked out of the bar because he drank too much and was causing problems, and everyone's like, oh, Uncle Henry, or whatever the uncle's name is. In Mary Poppins, it's the guy that like gets high on bubbles and he keeps laughing and he won't come down, and then she's like, no, kids, don't laugh, don't get high with your uncle, and then they start laughing and they start getting high. So like there's a lot of undertones in Disney of being inebriated is a fun thing, especially for children. I think it almost originated with Dumbo, right? Wandering into the big barrel full of who knows what, they say alcohol. It was probably DMT or something. Who knows? Like
I
ayahuasca.
start tripping.
But start tripping, and then not just that, but then that specific scene of the elephants comes up many times in other movies. It's almost like that homage, just like that the fifth or the ninth, right? Everyone wants to do a little homage to it and keep that going. But there's definitely a strong undertone of like children smoking and drinking and doing very adult things,
Sounds like a party.
like Pleasure Island, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you should be 18 before you party.
They never say that. That never comes up once in a Disney movie.
All right. Well, we are running low on time, so I just want to plug your guys' podcast. It's called the Occult Disney, Exploring the Hidden Mysteries Behind Mickey. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, on Scribed, on basically any podcast platform. And looks like you just recently did an episode on the adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. You talked about that. The Aristocats, then the Aristocrats. Yeah. Bedknobs and Broomsticks was the movie I was thinking of when you were talking about the Gnome-mobile, because I think the boy makes an appearance in that. The boy from Mary Poppins is in Bedknobs and Broomsticks too, right? As is Dick Van Dyke. But yeah, is there any other place where people can find you guys?
You go first, Matt.
Yeah, that's the main one. If you check Occult Disney on Twitter, despite I'm not a Twitter head, but hey, if you want to talk to me there, send a message, and I'll probably respond there. So that's the best place if you want to interact with Occult Disney Podcast. We do have a Patreon with some other podcasts. I'll quickly mention that's Podcastius on Patreon. Myself and some of my friends, we also talk about the Twilight Zone, good films, bad films, video games, all that sort of stuff. So if you check that out, you'll see a larger podcasting world. And Thomas, you have your own sphere of highly entertaining stuff.
Yeah, so a couple other podcasts I work on, occultbookclub.com. We just review really old arcane texts, a lot of alchemy, a lot of philosophy, and a lot of dick jokes. So if you like any of those things, occultbookclub.com is a really good spot for that. I also co-host Reality Czars. I also do a show called Sink Tank on Tuesdays with Andre Zertis, where we talk about everything from Tartaria and flat Earth to like modern day AI and microchips from Taiwan. And then Kyle, I couldn't help but notice, but you've got some CGC graded comics, I believe, in the background, if my eyes don't. So I've also been publishing comic books for the last 10 plus years. 2012, I started Paranoid American, and I've got about 50 different titles under my belt now. I've got, I think, at least 10 or so that are available on Amazon. And one of my favorite go-tos to suggest is I've made this Paranoid pamphlet on MK Ultra. And if you recognize the format, it's kind of based on these old Chick tracts, if you know what a Chick tract is.
Mm-hmm.
But this little pamphlet, it's a little mini comic that breaks down the entire history of the MK Ultra program from Project Paperclip all the way to modern day. It's got Bluebird. It talks about Aldous Huxley. It talks about Frank Olson, a whole bunch of names, date, places, like just absolute facts. And this is just one of many that I've got. I also have a bunch of like regular, standard style comic books. One called Never a Straight Answer about Stanley Kubrick directing the Apollo moon landings.
Awesome.
I've got one called Time Samplers about two conspiracy theory researchers that use psychedelic astral projection in order to investigate things like the founding of the Federal Reserve, sheep-human hybrids, Project Monarch, just anything that conspiracy theory related. I've tried to make it like my life's mission to be like the guy that puts it into comic book form. So that you can definitely find me at paranoidamerican.com with all that and so much more.
Well, we do a comic podcast, Sam and I. Also, besides this, so you'll have to come on sometime.
Please, man, I'd love to talk comics.
All right,
So,
we're gonna
yeah.
make that connection. We're doing it. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being a part of our podcast today, and thank you to our chat for being so active. I think Sticks Boy, you take home the trophy. I think you posted probably 25 different messages, and thank you for doing that.
Hey, thank you.
Make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe if you want to keep seeing Thresholds of Reality content. And until next time, keep on exploring the edges of the unknown.